Hi, so my name is Ben Richardson. I'm at the University of Warwick, and today I'm going to be speaking to Dr Georgia van Toorn from the University of New South Wales, and she's the author of The New Political Economy of Disability, Transnational Networks and Individualised Funding in the Age of Neoliberalism. Hi Georgia, thanks for joining me today. So, in your book, you look at how disability support provision has been transformed across a number of countries through the adoption of an individualised funding model. This is something that allows recipients to cash out a personal budget and spend this on services from non-state providers. Could I begin by asking how you came to research this particular area, which, as you rightly argue in the book, is largely absent from the broader political economy literature on the neoliberalisation of the state?
Yes. So my interest in this area really stems from my undergraduate studies in social policy and politics. And at the time I started my PhD research, there was a quite significant social reform happening in Australia here, which I'm sure UK listeners will not necessarily know about, called the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And this scheme was basically the first in Australia to really address disability as a social citizenship, social rights issue, rather than a welfare issue or an object of charity or simply a private matter that is dealt with in the home or in institutions away from the public gaze. So it was really the first time that disability had been put on the political agenda here in Australia, and that was thanks largely to the advocacy of a lot of people with disability and their families. So I guess at the time I was a bit troubled though by the way in which this political discourse surrounding this scheme that was ostensibly very sort of socially progressive, rights-based social welfare scheme was sort of couched in the language of the market. It was all about consumer choice and the importance of that. And there was sort of an assumption made by policy elites in Australia, and then to some extent reproduced by grassroots campaigning and the general public discussion around the scheme, that if the government simply increased the funding for disability services, that a market would sort of spontaneously emerge, and that if people were free to choose and purchase their own support, that this would sort of solve the problems of disenfranchisement and lack of autonomy and independence for people with disability, and it could sort of liberate them from the shackles of paternalistic social services. And so to me, this seemed really problematic, because we know from other areas of the public sector that have been marketised that creating a profit-driven industry to meet a social need does not work according to the sort of free market model, and that simply giving people choice does not guarantee better outcomes for them, especially when we're talking about a group of people who have lived historically with very little agency and personal choice in their lives, and they're not necessarily overnight going to become savvy consumers, and nor do they necessarily have, or many of them, I'm not speaking about all people with disability because they're a huge, obviously diverse range of people, but many of them don't have the resources to work the system in that way. So I think it's important when we're talking about disability to sort of keep in mind that we're talking about a group of people, some of whom are very highly educated and highly equipped in working public bureaucracies and negotiating those and self-advocating, but also a large number who face multiple social forms of disadvantage, living in a large number live in poverty. They might have language or other cultural barriers. They might be caught up in the criminal justice system. So there are a whole range of ways in which a model built on self-advocacy and market principles isn't appropriate, in my view. So these questions around the state's role in social welfare and the encroachment of, I suppose, neoliberal values into the social welfare sector was what really got me interested in the topic, and what led me to explore where this particular model of individualised funding had come from and how it had spread globally since the sort of advent of neoliberalism in the 1980s, basically. So that was my PhD, and that work formed the basis of the book, The New Political Economy of Disability. And so, yeah, as I mentioned, I had no formal training in political economy, but it seemed to me that a political economy approach was the only way to really understand this phenomenon, and that there was room for me to make a contribution, because disability is often overlooked in political economy, even in its sort of most radical currents of schools of thought. Even now, I think as political economy and political economists are engaging more with issues that were once marginal, like sort of issues of gender and sexuality, queer theory, critical race theory, disability is often not recognised in that cluster of social categories or intersections. And I think it's a really important and useful lens through which to view the sort of big questions of political economy about the roles of states, the roles of markets, and state-citizen relationships. So, of course, there is a really important body of scholarship on the political economy of disability. That's not to say there's nothing been written on it, but I think for the most part this comes from the field of critical disability studies, and unfortunately it's quite marginal to political economy, the major political economy journals or textbooks and university curriculums. And I think that's unfortunate, because anyone who sort of engages with that scholarship, you sort of learn that how central disability actually is to many of the sort of central dynamics of capitalism, in terms of the way it structures labour markets, in terms of the way it creates a reserve army of labour that's important for conditions of capital accumulation, and the way in which people with disability are increasingly commodified in marketised social service systems. So, yeah, then as you mentioned, there's also very little engagement with disability in the literature on actual neoliberal welfare state restructuring, more specifically. Mm-hmm. I think partly due again to the invisibility of disability as a social justice issue, and also as a I guess more in academic terms, as a sort of category of analysis that really encapsulates many of the key social, political and economic trends that critics of neoliberalism and political economists more generally are interested in.
Thank you. Yeah, indeed. I'd like to talk now about the kind of argument of the book, and one of the major contributions it made to my mind was to really unpack the role played by disability activists and advocacy networks in advancing the individualised funding model, both within and across states, as you mentioned. And what this really brought home to me was, first, how there was this ethos of individual autonomy that was widely supported by disabled people as an antidote to what you mentioned as the paternalism of the Keynesian welfare state model in particular. But then also how professionalised NGOs in the movement turned this demand into a market-friendly policy amenable to politicians and bureaucrats who were wanting to restructure or reform the state-society relationship. So, as you mentioned in the book, there's been this sort of emancipatory agenda to individualised funding, which is not a phrase I usually associate with neoliberalisation, certainly in the literature I've read on it. And here you make an interesting connection with Nancy Fraser's work, and suggest that there are maybe some parallels here with the emancipatory agenda of liberal feminism vis-a-vis the welfare state and its patriarchy. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on those parallels a bit, and perhaps tease out some of the features that you felt were distinctive to disability politics. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really great question. I think you've encapsulated it really well. So Nancy Fraser's work was particularly germane to this topic, because she engages with the political economy debates and questions of economic justice without subsuming other types of harm so cultural and symbolic and political forms of oppression that may not necessarily be traceable to or exclusively to capitalism. And many readers or listeners to this might be familiar with her her writing on the different faces of injustice and the famous debate she had with Axel Honneth, where she advances an argument for both cultural recognition and socioeconomic redistribution. And so this idea of injustice as having both cultural and economic dimensions is really important, I think, in the context of disability, because, in my opinion, capitalism accounts for some, but not all, of the harms associated with disablement. And so the work that I drew on most in the book was her book, Fortunes of Feminism. It's called Fortunes of Feminism from State-Managed Capitalism to Neoliberal Crisis. And that book, it's obviously about the feminist movement, but many of the key insights were really applicable to disability politics. And so essentially what she argues in that book is that in the 1960s and 70s, liberal and mainstream feminism made a number of political gains in terms of rights and recognition, but that was in an age where social democracy was the status quo. And then, as we know, there was a crisis in social democracy and the sort of Keynesian welfare state, and capitalism entered a new phase, which is often referred to as neoliberalism. And so Fraser argues that in this moment, feminists continued to orient their struggles around the need for recognition, so cultural and symbolic forms of oppression, without coming to grips with the changing political economy and the fact that social democracy was no longer the primary threat to women's emancipation. And the result of this, Fraser argues, was she refers to as a dangerous liaison with neoliberalism, whereby feminists, in their sort of struggle against the injustices of social democracy and sort of Keynesian social protectionism, actually give neoliberalism an added legitimacy or a moral force that it otherwise lacked. And as I argue in the book, neoliberalism sort of turns these efforts to democratize the state and empower citizens against these social movements. And in the case of both the women's movement and particularly the disability movement, that sort of political message was deployed in service of a retrenchment agenda. So what I do in the book is try to sort of apply this lens to disability politics and the sort of changing political economy of disability provisioning. And I think it's really powerful, that argument that Fraser makes, in terms of drawing these parallels between the evolution of feminism on the one hand and the rise of identity politics, and then on the other hand, the sort of society-wide shift from state-managed capitalism to neoliberalism on the other hand. And so in applying that lens to disability politics, I'm sort of asking the question, well, why has the disability movement got behind this idea of individualized funding? Why did they come up with the idea in the first place? In fact, it originated in the disability movement. It was not conceptualized by the neoliberal policy elite that, are responsible for so many of the more sort of socially regressive policies that we often associate with neoliberalism. And so I guess asking that question immediately opens up some sort of weaknesses or blind spots in the sort of usual critiques that are made against neoliberalism. And many of those, in my view, contain a sort of implicit endorsement of or a glorification of sort of social democracy and Keynesian welfare state social service provision. But people with disability, like women, were in many ways sort of quite oppressed by that system, and the so-called sort of golden age of Keynesian social protectionism. Life was pretty brutal for a lot of disabled people at that time. People were trapped in institutions, excluded from education, excluded from the labour market, just generally excluded from social and political life. And importantly, they had no control over the support that they were offered by the state, and therefore no control over their life. So So there's this apparent logic to the idea that the market is an emancipatory force in the lives of these people, in the lives of people with disability, and the idea that giving people money in lieu of services will give them choice and therefore control and autonomy is a sort of appealing one, and it sort of makes sense in at one level. And for some people, it does give them that, but not for everyone. But I guess for me, I feel the model also undermines the idea of a social safety net, and it also facilitates this process of marketisation. So what my book tries to do is unpack that, and that process whereby the emancipatory discourse of the disabled movement became entangled with and at times played into this neoliberal paradigm of small government and consumer choice. But I try to do this in a way that takes disabled people's agency very seriously, and their arguments for individualised funding very seriously, and that starts from a place of wanting to hear their explanations. And so the book really heavily features disability activists and disability advocates, and some of the really key important players that facilitated the adoption of this policy in three nations, in Scotland, England and Australia. So I'm able to sort of show through that interview, empirical work, that disabled people were not sort of unknowing dupes of neoliberalism. They in fact drew selectively on neoliberalism and neoliberal discourse to argue a case for individualised funding, which they saw as important for their sort of social. It had a sort of social emancipatory agenda attached to it. But in appealing to that neoliberal agenda and that neoliberal language of consumer choice, they actually sort of vested it with an added moral weight and a sort of an emancipatory character, and contributed to the situation we have today where individual autonomy is sort of equated with consumer choice. And of course that was never the intention. But my critique is that was the unanticipated or unintended consequence of that liaison.
Yeah.
So my own sort of position on all this is that the entanglement of neoliberal and emancipatory ideals is actually an issue for people, including, I presume, a lot of political economists who believe in the welfare state and who believe that the state should have some role in responding to social need, with the caveat that, it needs to be reformed in ways that social protection isn't experienced as social oppression. And what that looks like in the case of disability is, I think, in my opinion, a strong publicly funded system of social services in which people with disability actually have a role in all aspects of policy development and service delivery, from actually designing these schemes to actually having ownership in and control over the organisations that deliver services. In Australia, we have this discourse now. We talk about Aboriginal controlled organisations, and this is really a recognition that Aboriginal, Indigenous people, First Nations people have the right to control the resources that are allocated, to ensure their health and well-being. And I think we need a sort of parallel arrangement in the disability sector where people with disability actually have control, not just over their support and their services that they receive, but actually over the resources and the political decisions that are made about their lives and about the sort of political arrangements that their autonomy, their independence, their freedoms are based on, they rely on. So I think instead, though, we have this system where a large portion of disability funding, unfortunately, goes towards, lining the pockets of large corporate care providers. And I think it's largely the same in the UK, from what I understand.
Thank you. That sort of links nicely into the next question I wanted to ask, when you were talking about the involvement, the ownership of people with disability in the policies that are intended to support them. Because I wanted now to talk about embodiment. And in the book, you, as you have now already, sort of stressed the diversity of groups speaking both as or for disabled people. And it did seem notable to me that many of those involved in the advocacy of individualised funding and its sort of transformation into a more market-friendly policy were not themselves disabled, although many had worked in that kind of sector of provision. And you also finished the book by stressing the need for future research to explore the differential consequences that individualised funding regimes have had for specific sections of the disabled community. So I was really keen to find out from you about some of the challenges that you've encountered in terms of data collection, research ethics, definitions of disability, and so on. When you've sought to acknowledge that kind of embodied inequality and try to bring disability as a lived experience into this book and other research that you've done.
Yeah, this is an important question too, because I, of course, the lived experience of people with disability is central to any judgment on the merits of this policy paradigm or this policy model that I'm critiquing in this book. And I should note that I do not identify as someone with a disability, so I don't have that lived experience. And so the project, as I mentioned, it was really based on a lot of empirical research, interviews with disability activists and advocates who were speaking often in a professional capacity. So they were representatives of a disabled people's organisation. They were quite prominent people in their activist communities, and they were also speaking in a personal capacity as a person in receipt of individualised funding. So they had first-hand experience of this policy, and I was, in terms of the field work, my experience was really shaped by a fantastic opportunity I had to spend, where I spent 9 months living in the UK, conducting my research out of the Strathclyde Centre of Disability Research, based at Glasgow University, and the rest of my candidature was here in Australia. But at that centre, there was really an amazing sort of community of disability scholars, many of whom identified as disabled. And being there, I was sort of able to make some really great connections with the disability movement there, which sort of really overlapped with the disability community. So I suppose because of the very people that I was speaking with, who were in, as I say, in positions of relative sort of authority in their social world, that they were speaking on behalf of, they were representative of organisations and people with disabilities, so they had a political voice in a way. Data collection and ethics were fairly straightforward because of that, and I guess because they were not the sort of people who were likely to be disenfranchised by individualised funding, although some had some really bad experiences, I have to say. One man I spoke to in Scotland, who was a very prominent disability activist and had been awarded an OBE, he had extensive experience in the policy and legal system there, told me that he'd been stuck in the second story of his home for 2 weeks because the wheelchair lift in his home had been in the company to whom the government had outsourced the service, didn't have the parts to fix it. And, so he rightly asked, well, why has there been no user involvement, no input from people with disability in this process? So I guess the main challenge, I suppose, that I was sort of negotiating throughout the fieldwork phase was really around some very sensitive issues in disability politics and disability research around who has the authority to speak about disability, where is what is the place of non-disabled people to comment on disability. These are all very sort of political questions, and this the community of disability activists in Australia in particular, maybe less so in the UK, is quite divided on some of these issues, and there are very stark I could say divisions between organisations and communities of activists that are led by people with disability and those who conform to a more sort of traditional model where it's mainly non-disabled people speaking on behalf of people or advocating on behalf of people with disability, and they are seen to be aligned with that sort of more paternalistic sort of charity-oriented view of disability. And so that's all to say that this is a very political field in a way. And as a non-disabled person, I was sort of conscious of contributing to a dynamic of non-disabled people speaking about disability issues, or even worse, contributing to the undermining of the disability movement through my critique of individualised funding. And so, as I've sort of said, my way around that was to really ground my analysis in the perspectives of the people that I was interviewing and really foreground their agency and their voice with extensive, quotes throughout the book. But I guess the book is really about how this model of individualised funding spread globally through networks of disability activism and advocacy, and about those sort of macro policy processes rather than an account of the lived experience of disability or people who are receiving this form of individualised service provision. It's not an in-depth look at the lived experiences of disablement under this model. It's that I think that research is extremely important, and others are doing it all around the world. But that is something that's not necessarily within what the book is trying to achieve. Maybe that might be the next one.
Thank you. Thanks. So you've already mentioned in one of your earlier answers about the links and relationships between political economy and disability studies, and so I just wanted to return to that now, if I may. And when I was reading your book, partly because I'm sort of preparing my teaching for the year ahead, it struck me that your case study had resonance with a whole host of topics that you would likely see in a kind of contemporary international political economy syllabus or research agenda. So your focus is on neoliberal policy mobility, but then you also touch on the use of algorithmic decision making in welfare provision, in a kind of evolving discourse on the undeserving poor, and the role of non-profit organisations as market actors, among many other things. So I was kind of wondering if these or any other topics jumped out to you as sort of potential candidates for political economy analysis, in the same way you were saying the spread of the policy did initially. And conversely, maybe, are there any intellectual tools that you've taken from disability studies that you think could kind of enrich political economy scholarship more widely? I think you mentioned already disablement, and I've come across a notion of ableism as well, and I just would be keen to know your thoughts on these possibilities for sort of mutual learning.
Yeah, I think those policy areas that you mentioned are really fascinating, and I think they're all examples of where an international political economy approach could be really valuable. And in a way, they're all those sort of approaches that you mentioned are sort of products of neoliberalism at one level. Algorithmic decision making in terms of its sort of orientation to efficiency, standardization, cost cutting. Discourses that moralize the poor, reinforce ideas of personal responsibility, and certainly the participation of non-profit organisations in quasi-markets. They're all manifestations of a similar ideological paradigm or project. And many of these examples share something in common with individualised funding, and that they're sort of discussed as ways of improving services or improving governance or helping people break free from the constraints of government intervention or whatever. But they actually fail to address the core social inequalities that the welfare state is tasked with addressing. And in so doing, they often sort of exacerbate many of the issues that contribute to the unjust outcomes of historically marginalised groups, including people with disability. So I think that's where a political economy approach, particularly international political economy approach, is important. In terms of sort of drawing those connections between different jurisdictions, different areas in which these social policy experiments are happening all around the world, and B, sort of locating all these different experiments within a common framework of global capitalism, because it is, a common logic, or there are common drivers underlying these various trends, and you can draw those connections without necessarily resorting to essentializing or simplistic accounts of neoliberal hegemony. Or I found the policy mobilities approach, which I used in the book, was a particularly useful way of doing that, and that school of thought, developed by people like Jamie Peck, grew out of a marriage of political economy and human geography. So I think there are some very useful tools there in terms of for people who want to take that international perspective, but who are also interested in questions of political agency and the sort of specific social dynamics that play out within countries. And in terms of what disability studies can offer political economy, I think I sort of had to think about this, and I think that probably one of the first and most immediately useful tools is the social model of disability, which I'm not sure if you've come across this idea. Basically, it's the idea that people are not disabled by their bodily impairment, but by the social structures that isolate and exclude and devalue people with impairments and prevent them from participating in social life on an equal footing with others. So this was a sort of very formative idea, a very formative model or framework to come out of the disability movement, and I think shares some commonalities with political economy in terms of its focus on social structure and ideas of social embeddedness and the intersection of social structure and human agency or personal biography. So I think that is one tool that is in many ways a sort of good fit with political economy approaches to disability, because the focus is on disablement as a form of social oppression, and a form of oppression that stems in part from the way capitalism structures society. It's not rooted in biology. And there, I just thought I'd mention some classic texts and really fantastic works that use that model, or sort of, I guess, start from that materialist analysis. One is a book by a guy called Roddy Slorak. It's called A Very Capitalist Condition, and that sort of analyses the various aspects of disability, history and politics from a Marxist perspective. There's also some works by Marta Russell, including a book called Beyond Ramps, Disability at the End of the Social Contract. And so that she explores the origins of disabled people's marginalisation in capitalism and sort of locates that in capitalism's austerity politics and the power of corporations. And then lastly, I should also mention an Australian disability scholar, actually, Karen Soldatic, and her book Disability and Neoliberal State Formations. It's a very important book about the intersection of neoliberalism and disability, and a classic work also by Deborah Stone called The Disabled State. I think all those books, they're sort of classic texts on political economy and disability, and would be a really fantastic way to put those two fields into conversation with each other.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that was the purpose of the sort of interview today. So that's a nice point to end on as well, I think. So thanks so much for doing this today. It's been so enlightening, and best of luck with the next book project.
Thank you. No problem. Thanks for the invitation.
You're welcome.